Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 25th of November. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 275 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Russia risked causing a nuclear and radioactive catastrophe by launching attacks in which all Ukraine's nuclear power plants were disconnected from the power grid for the first time in 40 years. All nuclear power stations in the government-controlled part of Ukraine are up and running again and connected to the main electricity grid, the country's energy provider, Ukrenergo, has said. The European Union is pressing ahead with a ninth sanctions package on Russia in response to Moscow's attack on Ukraine, the European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen has said during a visit to Finland. President Zelensky said Russia's new strategy to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure would not weaken the country's resolve to liberate all occupied land. In his address late on Thursday night, President Zelensky said, "Together, we endured 9 months of full-scale war, and Russia has not found a way to break us and will not find one." Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said his country's parliament would ratify NATO membership for Finland and Sweden early next year. Hungary will provide €187 million in financial aid to Ukraine as its contribution to a planned EU support package worth up to €18 billion during 2023. Russia and Ukraine have carried out the latest in a series of prisoner of war exchanges, with both sides handing over 50 people, officials in Kyiv and Moscow have confirmed. Ground battles continue to rage in eastern Ukraine, where Russia is pressing an offensive along a stretch of front line west of Donetsk, which has been held by Russian proxies since 2014. Forbes Ukraine estimates that Russia has spent $82 billion, a quarter of its annual budget, on the war in Ukraine. The Russian war effort in Ukraine is characterized by confusion amongst reservists over eligibility for service and also inadequate training and equipment, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. The UK believes that the Kremlin is likely to be worried about reservists' families who will risk arrest by protesting about the conditions that their relatives are facing on the front. Half of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, is still without power. Energy companies are working to get electricity restored, which will give people power for 3 hours on an alternating basis. The NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, has said that there would be no lasting peace if Russia wins in Ukraine. He said NATO will continue its support for Ukraine and increase non-lethal aid. And more than 15,000 people have gone missing during the war in Ukraine. Matthew Holliday, the International Commission on Missing Persons, their director for Europe, has said. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular friend to Broadcasting Scotland. William Duguid is an activist, a commentator and blogger, and was seen most recently speaking at the rally at Perth on Wednesday night. He also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm fine, thank you very much. It's been a busy old week, though, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and we're delighted that you've been able to make a little bit of time to join us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, William. Thank you. Our first story this evening is that nurses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland will go on strike for the first time over 2 days in the fortnight before Christmas, after ministers rejected their pleas for formal talks over NHS pay. The Royal College of Nursing said its members would stage national strikes, the first in its 106-year history, on the 15th and 20th of December. Senior sources said the industrial action was expected to last for 12 hours on both days, most likely between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. In Scotland, the RCN has paused announcing strike action after the Scottish Government offered a record-high pay deal to Scottish NHS staff. The RCN said it had confirmed the dates after the UK Government turned down its offer of formal, detailed negotiations as an alternative to industrial action. The Scottish Government's record high pay offer, the best in the UK, will ensure that these frontline workers will receive pay rises ranging from £2,205 to £2,751, which is a further improvement on the existing offer for staff in bands 5 to 8A. For the lowest paid, this represents an uplift of 11.3% and delivers an average uplift of 7.5%. The increased offer was made after constructive negotiation between the Scottish Government and NHS unions. In a final offer made to trade unions, the new deal is worth an additional £515 million in 2022-23 and now includes a package of progressive measures to promote staff and patient safety, support long-term workforce sustainability, and to recognise the breadth of skills and experience of NHS Scotland staff. The settlement ensures that the NHS staff would remain the best paid anywhere in the UK. It gives all frontline NHS Scotland AFC staff in bands 1 to 7 a pay premium of between £1,149 and £2,834 over their counterparts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So, William, firstly, looking at the big picture and then the story here, do you think is there a particular significance in that the Royal College of Nursing has said that its members will be staging national strikes in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the first strikes in its 106-year history?
Yes, that has to be significant, and it's an indication of the extent to which the impasse seems to be in place between them and the Westminster government. Each side seeming to be saying that the door is open, but nobody ever seems to walk through the door and have constructive negotiations. And there is an absolute contrast there with the position in Scotland, where it looks as if we're getting towards possibly some sort of settlement there. And I very much hope that the new improved offer is accepted there. But always industrial problems do get sorted out, but this Westminster government does not seem to be very quick about sorting out its own situation.
Absolutely, William. And how do you think the public, especially in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, how do you think that they are going to react to apparently the Royal College of Nursing pressing ahead with industrial action?
Well, I think increasingly people are understanding the pressures that workers are under in terms of just making ends meet and the need to keep up as much as possible with inflation in a situation where costs are rapidly increasing. So there is always going to be a certain amount of sympathy. In the media, however, there is always just a slight tendency to be trying to call out the union side of things as in some way unreasonable. There's always a sort of propaganda war goes on there, and I see elements of that going on even now. So it's all going to be down to whether the public understands that the government has a thing to do here. The Westminster government has a responsibility to be keeping the NHS on track. It's already under huge pressure, and strike action cannot really do anything other than make things worse. And the public sympathy for the nurses, I think, will be under some pressure as time goes on. And that's to an extent what the UK government is counting on. But we will just have to see what happens.
Completely, William. And do you think, what are we to take from the distinction between the Scottish Government, which has continued to negotiate and has made a further enhanced offer to the trade union in Scotland, in contrast to the approach in England, where the politicians and in effect the English Parliament have point blank refused to negotiate?
You can't help but suspect that there's some calculation in that. It's so difficult to appreciate a government actually benefiting from effectively causing chaos, but we are involved in, if you like, a war on several fronts against several of the workers in public industries. There's no doubt about it. And I think the government sees itself as playing a kind of hard ball there. There is a huge contrast with Scotland. We don't have an interest in fighting this as a war against the public industries. We want everything to be running smoothly, and yet the Scottish government is in a situation where it's spinning plates. If it isn't the nurses, it's the teachers, and if it isn't the teachers, it's the transport folks. And it's a limited budget, and I'm amazed that the Scottish government is still in the game, to be honest. It's done very well to hopefully stave off the action on the nurses' part right now. The teachers will be next, no doubt, but eventually the money runs out. And of course, the alarming thing is the Westminster government could fix this in an instant. The Westminster government can find the money because it can print the money if it comes to it, or it can borrow extra money. It's got all the levers. And yet it's the one that seems to not want to do that. A very, very strange situation. I don't know how we'll look back on this in years to come.
That's a very good point, William. Some perspective on this once we're through the winter will undoubtedly be instructive for us all going forward. Let's move to our next story now, because universities could go bankrupt if the government limits the number of foreign students in a bid to bring down net migration, an advisor on immigration policy has warned. Rishi Sunak's potential plan to clamp down on international students taking low-quality degrees could send many universities over the edge, particularly in poorer regions, the chair of the government's Migration Advisory Committee has said. Professor Brian Bell told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, most universities for most courses lose money on teaching British students and offset that loss by charging more for international students. If you close down the international route, I'm not sure how the universities continue to survive. He went on, he said London, Cambridge and Oxford would do well if overseas students were only allowed places at elite universities, asking, but what about Newcastle? What about the North East, the North West, Scotland? Commenting, the SNP Shadow Home Secretary, Stuart MacDonald MP, said, the Tories trashed the economy with Brexit and now they are proposing an absurd ban on international students that would deal another hammer blow to Scotland's economic interests. If Westminster imposes this ludicrous and entirely counterproductive policy, it will be doing so against Scotland's wishes and in the face of strong opposition from the Scottish Government. International students bring huge benefits to Scottish society, our education system and economy. Yet again, the losers from this Tory policy will be communities across the length and breadth of Scotland. He added, with the Labour Party merging with the Tories on the hostile environment, Brexit and austerity cuts, it's clear there's no change on offer at Westminster. The only way to protect Scotland's economy and get back on the path to prosperity is to become an independent country. So, William, firstly, before we get into the detail round about the policies at the back of this, one thing leapt off the page at me when I was reading this story. So, Professor Bell said that London, Cambridge and Oxford would do well if overseas students were only allowed at places at elite universities, and then went on to say, what about Newcastle? What about the North East, the North West and Scotland? Implying somehow that Scottish universities are not elite. And I wonder, is this part of the problem in the midst of this, the hostile environment and the immigration debate generally? This year, St Andrews came top of the Sunday Times ranking, beating Oxford and Cambridge. Edinburgh came 10th, Glasgow came 14th, both in the UK. So why would somebody like Professor Bell be bracketing Scottish universities, one of which was the best in the UK last year? Why would he be bracketing them with other parts of the UK where that's not the case? And what does that tell us about the way in which this immigration debate is being framed in England?
Well, to be kind to him, maybe it just didn't occur to him that the Scottish universities might be elite, because Oxford and Cambridge and London, yeah, they're the bee's knees, aren't they? I mean, it's just written in stone, isn't it, within the London-centric and indeed Oxbridge-centric view of education. This this idea of low quality degrees intrigues me. What is a low quality degree? Who decides what a low quality degree is? Does a university offer nothing but low quality degrees, or are some of its degrees okay and others not? It's an insane way to be looking at things. And it seems to me that in terms of net migration, which has leapt of late, and there are particular reasons for that to do with Ukraine and also to do with Hong Kong, is this just a soft target for it? Because there's no doubt in my mind that with the Erasmus scheme and similar things in the past, Scotland and indeed the UK has benefited enormously from the exchange of students with our students going abroad and foreign students coming here. And that kind of mix is only to our benefit in terms of increasing our appreciation of each other and where we stand in the world. And for us to be doing this sort of damage to things just on the basis of keeping net migration down to an arbitrary figure, particularly when Scotland doesn't have any real interest at the moment in having low net migration figures because we need greater working age population. It's just insane to my, and I believe it's a dog whistle, yet another dog whistle to the racist core of voters that has driven us down so many of the dark alleys of politics in recent years.
Thank you, William. Yes, I thought I certainly detected the sulphurous odour of a Braverman policy and the hostile environment at the back of this story. So I can only agree with you. It feels like part of the ongoing culture wars, and to be dragging education into the hostile environment seems perverse. But let's move on to our next story now, because Rishi Sunak has been criticised over the reappointment of Jacob Rees-Mogg's business partner as a trade minister after the Conservative peer suggested farmers could be helped to turn their barns into offices or whatever if they are hit by post-Brexit trade deals. Dominic Johnson, with whom Rees-Mogg co-founded Somerset Capital Management, also faces questions about potential conflicts of interests after he disclosed that he still has a substantial financial interest in the asset management business and other companies, including a cigar website and crypto data businesses. He was given a seat in the House of Lords by Liz Truss's government before being made an investment minister, but Sunak sacked him 26 days later. He's now been reinstated, however, as an unpaid senior minister of state in the Department for International Trade under Kemi Badenoch. As he left his previous job, he gave an interview to Politico saying he thought the government needed to be more honest with farmers that their businesses would be harmed by post-Brexit trade deals allowing cheaper food imports from abroad. He also suggested ministers could do more to explain how they could help convert agricultural buildings to offices or whatever it is. Johnny Hall, the Director of Policy at the National Farmers Union Scotland, expressed his concerns about the UK government's retained EU law bill and the risk to farmers post-Brexit, particularly around the lack of clarity and certainty about the processes involved and the intentions involved. So, William, firstly, now that Dominic Johnson is in the House of Lords, Huffington Post has learned that he is yet to fill in his register of members' interests, the record of anything which could be seen to influence how MPs or peers vote or act. On the 26th of October, Johnson told the Lords he would complete the register, hopefully by the end of the month. He hasn't. So his failure to fulfill this pledge, he's at a time when he's already been off trying to do trade deals without declaring his financial interests. Do you think that's a problem?
How can it not be a problem? Maybe there's nothing to see here, but we can't demonstrate it either way, can we? It's not a good way to do business at all. And there was no need for Rishi Sunak to have reappointed him in this situation. The only way I can interpret this is the continuing chaos, really, in the Westminster Cabinet, which seems to be appointments on the basis of expedience rather than ability, keeping sections of the Conservative Party quiet and happy and not rebelling. And it's, again, it's no way to do government. It does not result in anything effective or consistent. It merely drags it all over the place. And If you look at the rest of the cabinet, with Dominic Raab's place now in some question, Suella Braverman's jacket's got to be in a shaky nail, and everything else that we've seen, um, get your popcorn out. It continues to be something to watch.
Well, I was going to ask you about the Tory talent puddle, which seems to have just about evaporated, but instead I was going to ask you a broader point. Is it sensible or appropriate that ministerial posts like this are filled by billionaire hedge fund managers who will, of course, know the price of everything, but probably know the value of nothing?
Well, you might accidentally find a hedge manager that's brilliant, but it's highly unlikely that a succession of hedge fund managers or people from that talent puddle will all be brilliant. There's clearly something else going on here. It's expedience and it's not ability, and it needs to be ability. Surely we need our best people, not C-listers or D-listers now, to be running things, because the economy is in chaos here, and the best brains just don't. Well, I'm not entirely convinced there are many of the best brains left in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, but let's at least make a better search for them than we're currently carrying out.
And actually, one final question on this story: the rather dismissive manner in which Mr. Johnson appears to be treating the agricultural sector and the farming sector in the UK. Does that suggest to you that does that dismissive attitude suggest to you that we're going to begin to see a succession of trade deals negotiated, which continue the process that we're currently in, but whereby they damage the interests of the agricultural sector in the UK and in Scotland, and they put at greater risk the supply chain for food upon which we all rely?
Supply chain is one thing for sure. I'm very concerned about the farming sector in Scotland. Ever since Brexit, I have been, but the more I hear from Westminster, the more worried I am. The removal of EU legislation via sunset clauses, which will be taking place in the not too distant future, without necessarily any guarantee that better written laws are going to replace them, makes me still more worried. Dominic Johnson's talk about farmers changing their whatever it was as to offices or whatever it is. See, I'm being vague when I say it myself, because it was a vague, tin-eared statement. It showed no appreciation of the sector he was supposed to be dealing with. And, that is just not acceptable.
Completely. We'll be watching Mr. Johnson's performance closely, I'm sure, on Broadcasting Scotland. But let's move on to our next item now, because a former soldier who shot dead a civilian as he walked through a British Army checkpoint in Northern Ireland during the Civil War has been convicted of manslaughter. In Belfast Crown Court today, 53-year-old David Jonathan Holden was found guilty of gross negligence when he shot Aidan McAnespie on the 21st of February 1988, making the former Grenadier Guardsman the first Army veteran to be convicted of a historical offence in Northern Ireland since the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Holden admitted firing the shot from a machine gun, but said his finger slipped on the trigger when McAnespie, 23, passed the checkpoint at Auchnacloy in County Tyrone. McAnespie was hit in the back by a ricochet and died at the scene. Mr. Justice O'Hara, sitting without a jury, ruled that Holden had pointed the gun at the victim and pulled the trigger while assuming the gun was not cocked. That assumption should not have been made, the judge told the court. Holden had been given a deliberately false... The judge told the court that Holden had given a deliberately false account of what happened. Holden is to be sentenced at another hearing next year. Members of Mr. McAnespie's family hugged and cried after the verdict. Holden remained impassive. The ruling has angered veterans groups and comes as the UK government pushes ahead with controversial legislation that proposes an effective amnesty for those accused of killing or maiming people during the Civil War. Critics say it is an attempt to shield former soldiers from justice. Aidan McAnespie had been on his way to a Gaelic football match across the Irish border when he was killed. The army considered him a person of interest, a potential IRA member, but he was unarmed. A manslaughter charge against Holden was dropped in 1990, prompting a long campaign by Mr. McAnespie's family for a prosecution that culminated in today's verdict, 34 years after the shooting. The judge said that Holden, who was from England and was 18 at the time, was criminally culpable for assuming that the gun was not cocked. After the shooting, Holden was fined for negligent discharge of his weapon and medically discharged from the army. So, William, I'm old enough to remember Mr. McAnesby being killed. And as I say, as I've just said, the judge today said that Holden was criminally culpable for assuming that his gun was not cocked. The judge said this was the ultimate take no chances situation because the risk of disaster was so great. The judge said that the defendant should have appreciated at the moment he pulled the trigger that if the gun was cocked, deadly consequences might follow. The judge said that the defendant took an enormous risk for no reason in circumstances where he was under no pressure and in no danger. And I just wondered, is that in fact a useful metaphor for British involvement in the civil war in the north of Ireland before the Good Friday Agreement? The risk of disaster was so great, but nobody was paying close enough attention.
Very possibly. I mean, that whole time is a mess. And it's a sad reflection, perhaps, on it that it has taken families so long to get anything approaching justice. And we may not be finished with this story even now, because undoubtedly Mr. Holden will appeal. And there are questions to be asked about what is an 18-year-old doing holding a machine gun at a checkpoint? I know he's of an age to be serving in the army, but I think his superiors might have something to answer about this as well. The whole thing is a mess, and our involvement in Northern Ireland over the years still raises so many questions, as does nowadays our attitude to the Northern Ireland Protocol now, and the mess of getting it out of Brexit and the risks we run of getting back into that situation. This is a sad situation, and I'm pleased that justice appears at this stage to have been done. But this history will continue to be written for many years to come, I fear.
I think you're right, William. The history of the island of Ireland continues to be written, and the history continues to resonate today. I was also going to ask you, Conservative MPs and Army veterans groups have called this prosecution vexatious. So should British Army soldiers who shoot unarmed civilians in the back be prosecuted? Or why do you think Tory MPs and Army veterans groups think that servicemen serving in Northern Ireland should apparently be above the law?
I don't know, because they shouldn't be above the law. What happened there was wrong. It was culpably negligent. Get these words out, and that is, there is no way you have immunity from prosecution. The fact, though, is that prosecutions remain incredibly rare. And therefore, a lot of families are still looking for justice on both sides of the conflict. And that, I fear, is something that will never be totally healed. And I wish it were otherwise.
Thank you, William. Let's move on to our next story now, because the extremist Israeli politician Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has a long record of anti-Arabic rhetoric and stunts, will become the country's next Minister of National Security, according to the first of what are expected to be several coalition deals struck by the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. Likud announced an agreement with Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party today. Negotiations with three other potential far-right and ultra-Orthodox coalition partners are continuing. If successful, Netanyahu would return to the Prime Minister's office and preside over the most right-wing and religious government in Israel's history. The awarding of such a sensitive role to Ben-Gvir raises concerns of a further escalation in Israeli-Palestinian tensions. Ben-Gvir and his allies hope to grant immunity to Israeli soldiers who shoot at Palestinians, deport rival lawmakers, and impose the death penalty on Palestinians convicted of attacks on Jews. Ben-Gvir is a disciple of the racist rabbi Meir Kahane, who was banned from parliament and whose Kach party was labelled a terrorist group by the US before he was assassinated in New York in 1990. Ahead of Israel's election on the 1st of November, Ben-Gvir made the headlines for his anti-Palestinian speeches and stunts, including brandishing a pistol and encouraging police to open fire on Palestinian stone throwers in an already tense Jerusalem neighborhood. Before becoming a lawyer and entering politics, he was convicted of offences that include inciting racism and supporting a terrorist organisation. In his new role, Ben-Gvir would be in charge of the police, among other things, enabling him to implement some of the hardline policies against the Palestinians he has advocated for years. As part of the coalition deal, the Ministry of Internal Security will be renamed the Ministry of National Security and be given expanded powers, the Likud said in their announcement earlier today. So, firstly, William, thinking of the story we were just touching on, Ben-Gvir, a practicing lawyer, champions capital punishment and looser open-fire regulations for soldiers. It sounds like he'd be on the side of British Army veterans who shoot unarmed civilians in the north of Ireland, doesn't it?
That did occur to me as a bit of a parallel, yes. um, it's really somebody with a track record of incitement. And with those views that he has repeatedly expressed, even if he's just rode back a little bit from some of them, is an indication of where the situation in Israel is going. The fifth election in less than 4 years, so we have an unstable situation, and the way in which Mr. Netanyahu has chosen, I think, to resolve this is to go for a narrow ideological government in an attempt, presumably, to stave off a sixth election. I dare say politicians and the electorate are tired, and maybe it's showing, but this is no way to move forward because things are getting ever more heated, and I don't see this really resulting in anything good over time. The thing that disturbed me about Mr. Ben-Gvir is that he has quite a high appeal with younger voters. Older voters don't seem to be quite so happy about him, presumably because they're aware of Kahani and all that thing. But this guy is going to be around for some time, and he's going to be increasingly influential. And I don't think that can be good.
Absolutely, William. Thank you. Now, as a settler living in the West Bank, Ben-Gvir has long been a fierce opponent of Palestinian statehood, and as we were discussing during this election campaign, he demonstrated that by brandishing a pistol at Palestinian demonstrators in occupied East Jerusalem. He also supports Jewish prayer at the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex, which is a flashpoint site holy to both Muslims and Jews, who they know it as the Temple Mount. The site, said to have once housed 2 ancient Jewish temples, has been the scene of repeated clashes between Muslims and Jewish visitors who have been defying a decades-old rule which prohibits prayer by non-Muslims there. So is Mr. Gvir in any way an appropriate person to be in government? Is he in any way an appropriate person to be in charge of the policing of parts of the occupied West Bank?
I think not. Often you do see people who've expressed extreme views coming into some sort of power, and they do moderate those views to an extent. But as you do that, the window shifts, and the window is shifting very much against the two-state solution and into increased repression of the Palestinians. And this appointment is not going to lower the temperature in that regard as they react to it. So I don't think he's an appropriate person, but I don't see any appropriate configuration of people in Israel coming to power that will make things better in the foreseeable future.
Completely. Thank you, William. Now we'll move on now, because a universal flu vaccine that protects against all strains of the virus could be available in the next 2 years. An experimental vaccine based on the same mRNA technology used in the highly successful COVID jags was found to protect mice and ferrets against severe influenza, paving the way for clinical trials in humans. Researchers have been working on universal flu vaccines for more than a decade, but this latest breakthrough, published in Science, is seen as a major step towards a jab that could help to protect humans from a potentially devastating flu pandemic. Seasonal flu vaccines, which protect against up to 4 strains of the virus, are updated every year to ensure they are a good match for the flu viruses in circulation. The new vaccine is designed to prime the immune system against all 20 subtypes of influenza A and B, potentially arming the body to tackle any flu virus that arises. The world last experienced a flu pandemic in 2009, when a virus that jumped from pigs to humans spread around the world. While that outbreak was far less lethal than health officials have feared, of course, the 1918 flu pandemic demonstrated how dangerous new strains of flu can be when it killed tens of millions of people. While the results from the animal tests are promising, clinical trials are needed to see whether the vaccine protects humans in the same way without causing problematic side effects. The vaccine raises questions for regulators around the world whether to approve a shot that could protect against viruses with pandemic potential, but which have not yet actually emerged. Adolfo Garcia Sastre, the director of the Institute for Global Health and Emerging Pathogens at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, said that current influenza vaccines did not protect against influenza viruses with pandemic potential. This vaccine, if it works well in people, would achieve this, he said. So, William, early days and no human tests yet, but as I was saying, while seasonal flu vaccines protect against up to 4 strains of the virus and have to be updated every year to ensure that they are a good match for the viruses which are in circulation in a particular year, this new vaccine is designed to prime the immune system against all 20 subtypes of influenza A and B, potentially arming the body to tackle any flu virus that arises. So do you think, is that an encouraging step forward in protecting the population of the planet from the risk of a potential pandemic?
Yes, I think if this does work, if it nails all the subtypes of virus that are likely to be out there, and that it gives you a baseline level of protection, so that if you do fall victim to flu, I'm guessing that your symptoms would be less likely to become severe. And hopefully a bit of an enhancement on what the COVID vaccines can do for COVID. So yes, it's a step forward. And always now in the world, we are thinking in terms of where is the next pandemic coming from? It was 100 years between the big pandemics of 1918 and 102 years till 2020 and COVID coming along. If we can reduce the likelihood of another flu pandemic, that would be fantastic. There's always going to be other unseen things round the corner, but at least it potentially gets one dangerous strain out of the way. So yes, let's keep our fingers crossed that there are no side effects that are significant when we do the tests, and let's see if we can get it into people's arms, hopefully in the time scale that they're talking about, which I think is maybe 2 or 3 years even.
That's a good point, William. And I was also thinking, we saw in recent weeks in England, a coroner for the first time confirmed that respiratory disease brought on by very poor housing conditions had been the cause of death for a young person. And now we're seeing in respect of respiratory disease, potentially significant step forwards in the prevention of serious respiratory disease. Do you think that suggests more generally that there is a growing recognition of the importance of addressing the risks of respiratory disease across the world?
Yes, I would say so, and honestly, it's not beyond our wit to do that. It's possible that things like respiratory disease come into the fore because we've maybe knocked out other things that were doing harm to people, so it's one of the ones that's left. But anything that can assist that, it was a shocking case, the wee boy that died of mold in the flat that we heard about earlier this week. Anything we can do to address the various types of respiratory disease, including this, Jag, I'm all for. Let's hope for the best.
Thanks, William. And we'll come back to Scotland now for our next story, because Scotland's fishers will benefit from increased opportunities to access monkfish and other key demersal stocks following the successful conclusion of UK-Norway bilateral negotiations. Agreements on access and quota exchanges of fish stocks for 2023 have been signed, with key measures for Scotland's fishers including an exchange of quotas which will increase Scotland's opportunities to catch key demersal stocks, including monkfish, reciprocal access for demersal stocks which will allow Scottish fishers to fish their quota in Norwegian waters, giving them access to high market value stocks throughout the year, and an agreement on pelagic access which will enable Scottish vessels to fish Atlanto-Scandian herring in Norwegian waters. Scotland's Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gudgeon said, "This is a good outcome for Scotland's fishers, which builds on the successful arrangements for 2022. Norway is one of our closest coastal partners, and we share a number of fish stocks in the North Sea. I am pleased that a deal has been reached that will deliver benefits for both nations." She continued, "In particular, we have secured an increased inward transfer of monkfish. With the scientific advice for 2023 requiring a cut in overall monkfish quotas, this will play an important role in ensuring Scottish fishers can maintain access to this key stock." Now, William, of course, Norway is not in the EU, and as a result, the UK and Norway has always negotiated annually on access to each other's waters and on quota exchanges and control and enforcement measures. So in most years, this wouldn't be news, but clearly it's news nowadays. And why do you think it is that the fishing sector in Scotland is getting increased attention now?
Well, we're now looking at the post-Brexit settlement, aren't we? And therefore, having potentially lost access elsewhere or being under pressure for various reasons in terms of being able to sell fish, anything that can make life better for the Scottish fishing sector, I think, is obviously a good thing. And I would say here, it looks as if the UK government has actually worked with the devolved administrations to bring about these new agreements. And that is a good thing, with the UK government actually working with the Scottish and other governments. So, yes, it's news, but it's good news. And it's nice to have a good news story for a change, is it not?
Well, absolutely, William. And there was one other thing that it struck me I was going to speak to you about and ask you. On the one hand, we can see that this agreement is renegotiated annually, and I suppose that would be seen as being a positive thing insofar as fish stocks are measured and monitored on an annual cycle, and so an annual agreement would be required to match, as we say, the changing situation of demersal fish, for example, with the monkfish. But at the same time, we know that it has taken decades for herring to repopulate after it was almost fished out of the North Sea. And so, do you think, are we striking the right balance between annual renegotiation and potentially longer term strategies and plans, which require agreement between coastal nations covering several years, if not decades?
I think that latter bit is work in progress. So I would say let's not ask for the moon when we have the stars. There's a lot of work still to be done in terms of just the longer term sustainability of the seas and how it fits together with all the coastal nations. Let's hope that emerges in the years to come.
As you say, William, a work in progress. And now we'll come to our final item this evening. It's been a very busy week in politics and in the courts in Scotland. And following the Supreme Court's decision that the Scottish Parliament does not have the right to hold even a consultative referendum in case that vote for independence influenced a UK government decision on whether or not to agree to Scotland becoming an independent country. If colonies or oppressed peoples have the right to self-determination, why do the people of Scotland not have that right, and what is the status of the people of Scotland following Wednesday's ruling? Oppression does not need to take the form of violence, and recognised forms of oppression, including exploitation, marginalisation, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. First of all, to set the scene for our conversation, here's a clip of the rally which took place on Wednesday night at Buchanan Street in Glasgow.
Independence will not be given to us that easily. fantastic crowd we have here tonight. Whole of Buchanan Street, absolutely wonderful. All out to support independence. Many people are pretty angry about the decision of the Supreme Court, but my message to them is don't get angry, get even. Let's get out there and support the people on the streets, even political parties, and let's get independence.
The choice will be upon us soon, decide to destiny, and a drink our toast is Scotland yet, whatever yet may be.
This is the first ever rally that I've actually ever been to, and the atmosphere is intense. It's lovely. Today has been a sad day.
And the dark extreme, a fertile lowland field.
We will win our independence! We will do it! It's the Scottish will, and independence is inevitable!
There we are. There's some images and some sounds and some pictures from the rally which took place in Buchanan Street in Glasgow on Wednesday night, one of 15 rallies which took place simultaneously in towns and cities across Scotland and also in 6 cities across Europe. So, William, you at the time were present at the rally that was taking place in Perth, and you were speaking at that event. But let's look firstly at the broader picture in terms of the decision from the court. Some legal commentators were surprised that Lord Reid and the court expressed an opinion on the issue of the right to self-determination. It was not part of either the Scottish government or the UK government's case, and so the court did not require to give an opinion on it. However, Lord Reid did. So why do you think that the court did that?
Who knows what's in the minds of the judges? I thought it was a bit of a stretch to go there. And to interpret basically talk about the legal effects as being the potential effects of what a decision might bring about, which is to say, we didn't want Scotland to have its say on independence just in case it led to something. And that is a tremendous stretch for me. I don't want to criticise the Supreme Court judges. That would be dreadful. But I think that maybe there was just a hint of politics in there, and maybe there shouldn't have been.
That's a very good point, William, a very good point indeed. Do you think, now that we have the judgment from this judgment from the Supreme Court, do you think that it's possibly the case that, if I can describe it in that way, all of the legal stuff is now over, and it's now back to being all about the politics from now on?
I think it maybe is. It's quite important now that certainly the Scottish government comes to a decision on exactly where we do go for here, if we go for a plebiscitary election or what we now do. And I see that they're organising what I think will be an SNP conference. I'd rather it went a wee bit further, just so we could all come to an agreement on where we should go. For the Yes movement, we have a job as well, and that job is very much to persuade people to make sure that independence really can be demonstrated to be the settled will of the people of Scotland. Right now, it can be demonstrated to be the will of perhaps 50% or just over 50% or just under 50%. That ain't going to cut it now. I'm not an advocate of supermajorities, but I am an advocate of the popular will being both demonstrable and strong. And that's the only chance, I think, that gets us to independence. And that's a political thing, not a legal thing. Once the political pressure is there, the legalities will fall into place. They will have to.
Thanks, William. And in terms of that campaigning and that persuasion, do you think has the judgment has it in fact had the effect of putting energy and focus back into the independence movement after the years of the pandemic?
I very much hope so. It's vital that we do get straight back on the horse. This was not the end of the road. It was a fork in the road. It set out quite clearly what wasn't going to happen, but now we have to make something happen. We have to get our foot on the accelerator and get more passengers on the bus. I did feel in Perth that there was a mood of, a fairly positive mood, and a mood of determination, but also a recognition that the time for fighting amongst ourselves is over. We need now to work together big time and get to persuading people that independence is not only our way out of the current situation in which we find ourselves, but the normal and natural way by which Scotland and its people will flourish. And I think there was the mood to get on with that. I hope that as the winter draws on and Christmas approaches, that we don't lose any momentum. My feeling right now is that we won't, but it's not something that comes absolutely naturally. You have to keep working at it. So I hope the same is true of other places as well.
That's a very good point, William. When she spoke to the rally that was taking place at the same time at Holyrood on Wednesday evening, the First Minister spoke very much about what, in her words, was the transformation of the movement from the movement for independence to a movement for democracy. And since then, we've seen the SNP talking and messaging in terms of the democratic issues here. I think a number of unionists have bristled at that. And we'll maybe talk about that in a little bit. But in characterising it in this way, is the First Minister right? And do you think that there is a prospect that ultimately unionists will, she described as the more reflective unionists, that they will eventually have to face up to the fact that as a result of this decision by the court on Wednesday, there is a significant democratic problem here?
Yes. I mean, you cannot argue that this is a union of equals. You cannot argue that it's a voluntary union if we have no legal means of escaping it. You can't argue that it's a democracy if it keeps Scotland's aspirations in a straitjacket. And even people who don't do politics will notice that. And I think a lot of them will be pissed off by it. And yeah, the more reflective unionists will pick up on that. And they'll have to find a new way to explain to us why it is that we should stay in this union that we have no way out of, that we can without permission. What are we getting out of it? And I don't think there is necessarily a very good answer to that.
That's a good point, William. And you were talking there about the independence movement more generally. Having criticised this SNP policy, this route, in typically trenchant terms, Alex Salmond then proposed that indie parties should work together again. And now, in terms of that messaging, is that mixed and confusing messages, or is it in fact a reflection that the movement, as it affects political parties, that the movement is beginning to move forward once more?
The movement has no choice. If it's going to win this, it's got no choice but to work together, to stop taking pot shots at one another. I said in my speech on, this is quoting Leonard Cohen, on Wednesday, I said, if there are cracks in the Yes movement, we need to make sure that they're the sort that let the light in. Because let's face it, our opponents can't stand the sight of each other most of the time, even when they're in the same party, let alone different ones. So they spend most of their time scratching each other's eyes out, and yet they still manage to have a united front. So we have to find our own common ground and channel any anger we might feel, any frustration we might feel, in the right direction and in a common direction. The time for messing about is absolutely over. So whether Alex Salmond was giving a mixed message or not, I don't know. But when he said we should work together, he was absolutely right.
One can't disagree with that line. Absolutely right. And many congratulations for quoting Leonard Cohen on Wednesday and again this evening. We're very grateful to you for that. And to finish off the conversation this evening on this topic, we now know that, well, we've known for a while that the Scottish Government's policy, as a result of this decision on Wednesday, is to make the next election in Scotland a single issue election, effectively a plebiscite election. At this stage, and it's early days yet, but how do you think voters are going to react to that approach? And what chances do you think there are for a successful and effective plebiscite election?
I'm somewhat troubled by the plebiscite election route. I would much rather have had a straight referendum, although that currently is not on the table. So we moved to the plan B that had already been put out there as what would happen next. I think it all depends on whether our opponents put various spokes in the works with a plebiscitary election, because they can quite easily say, no, it's not about that, it's about other things. And there's also the question of whether Westminster is the appropriate election to do it in, or whether Holyrood is. And to be honest with you, they both have pros and cons. So I think it will be difficult. It's noticeable that the BBC, in some of its interviewing, has already begun to question the legitimacy of standing on the basis of a plebiscitary election, of making it a one-issue thing. I would have thought that any party has the right to stand on one issue if that's what it wants to do, and if the voters vote for it, that's fine. But that seems to be the line the unionists are taking, and I think we'll get more of that, and we need to have better answers to it fairly rapidly, I would say.
That's a very good point, William. Certainly, it crossed my mind that we had effectively a plebiscite. We had a single issue general election in 2019 with Boris Johnson with his three-word political messaging to get Brexit done, so that unionists now objecting to single issue general elections felt a little bit contradictory, if not hypocritical. But that's maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised at that feeling in listening to their complaints, and as you say, the messaging that we are beginning to see from the BBC. However, I'm looking at the clock and I can see that that is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Now, we will be back at 12 noon on Sunday with the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching, and of course, I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, William Duguid. William, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm reminded that on this day in 1835, in Dunfermline, Andrew Carnegie was born. He founded what became the Carnegie Steel Company in the United States. He's principally remembered for funding large numbers of libraries and educational institutes and establishments in the US, Scotland, and elsewhere. I'm away to look for the peacocks in Pittencrieff Park in Dunfermline. Please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.